Hey, I want to welcome everybody to the session on Towards a Decarbonized Future. And it is my great pleasure to have two speakers today who are going to provide you with an overview of some of the cutting edge research and science around a decarbonized future. I'm going to introduce our first two speakers and then let Jennifer speak, followed by Andrew. Jennifer Holm is a research scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and she's in the earth and environmental science area. And I heard her on NPR. So as we were preparing this event, I heard about her activities at COP26 in Scotland, and I reached out to her to give you an overview of her research as well as what happened at COP26. Why does that matter for building HVAC service technicians? And how do you understand where we are as a global community in setting our agenda for decarbonization? So she is going to give you an introduction into what happened there. But she herself is a scientist who has background in environmental studies. She's got degrees from University of Virginia and University of Florida, where she's been doing research on ecosystems. So she'll talk a little about her work as well as the work of others in COP26. Next, we're going to hear from Commissioner Andrew McAllister with the California Energy Commission, and he leads the energy efficiency work at the CEC, where he works on energy efficiency standards, appliances, and helping to set the policy for developing and deploying clean and cost-effective solutions for the California and the United States, because Andrew works with states throughout the country. So the work in California is often at the cutting edge of the state policies, and we're very fortunate to have him participate today in the event and give you an overview of some of the critical things happening in California. So what we're going to do is we're going to hold the Q&A till the end. I'll be watching the chat, but I want to make sure our speakers have time. The session goes until 9:45, so each speaker will talk for about 20 minutes, and we'll have about 10 minutes of Q&A at the end. So Jennifer, take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that introduction. That is great. And let me share my screen and start this from the beginning. Well, yeah, hello, everybody. I'm Jennifer Holm, and I'm very excited to be here and to be talking to you all. I'm very happy to have this invitation. So yes, this presentation is going to be a science-y journey. Really kind of starting with, I'm going to start by talking about the current state of climate change. And yes, I said science, so there's going to be figures, so I hope you could bear with me. And then I'm going to talk about some of my takeaways from the COP26 conference in Glasgow. And then I'm going to transition to look at different decarbonization pathways. And then ending with, what is the state of forests and nature in current climate change models? So yeah, I just want to start by showing the different model trajectories of where we're going with human-induced warming. So this orange line on the left, this shows our warming to date, and with the dashed arrow indicating the time and range at which 1.5 degrees Celsius will be reached if the current state of warming continues. And I'd like to reiterate and have you guys remember this 1.5 degree threshold, because this is the cutoff for when scientists agree there'll be large consequential impacts of climate change, and some of which are irreversible for generations to come. So this purple plume is showing the warming if we decline net CO2 emissions to 0 by 2055. And the blue plume is what we'd like to reach. And this shows the response to faster CO2 emission reductions and reaching net 0 by 2040. And to reach this blue curve, as seen in the top figure, there needs to be this fast and immediate reduction in CO2 emissions. And you can see this as a very dramatic and urgent decrease. However, even with emissions going to 0, this still leaves a lot of cumulative CO2 emissions in the atmosphere. You see it at the bottom figure. So a main takeaway I'd like to stress is that greenhouse gases accumulate in our atmosphere and biosphere, and specifically CO2 can persist for a century or more. So every little bit of CO2 release matters and will contribute to warming. So there are two main things that we need to keep track of with pollution into the climate system. First, how fast is the warming and how high is the warming? So the rate of change and the magnitude of change. And there are pollutants that only last a couple days or decades in the atmosphere, but are much more potent. So methane is a greenhouse gas that you probably have heard of, and it's 80 times more potent than CO2. And right now we're at this crucial point of warming that can either lead to more methane emissions or not. So right now we're at this risk where there could be a large increase in methane due to thawing of permafrost and changing in wetland emissions, or we could try to help change that. And yeah, reducing methane emissions has the potential to reduce the rate of warming significantly. And then carbon dioxide is by far the largest emission and largest contributor to climate change. And CO2 can persist in our atmosphere for over a century. So this will contribute to the long-term magnitude of climate change. So another concept, I'd like to kind of convey is this theme of positive climate feedbacks. And these are crucial feedback loops that occur in the climate biosphere system, because as global warming increases, this then leads to things like more sea ice melting, which exposes more dark ocean, which dark ocean absorbs more heat, and then warmer oceans take up less CO2. So all this leads to speeding up of warming. So all these cycles continue, and they're very similar, and they continue for other ecological processes like wildfires and storms. So this figure I'm showing from the IPCC report, and they have made a timetable of the remaining carbon budget to remain at this critical 1.5 degrees. So this figure shows that with each increase of CO2 emissions on the x-axis, there is a linear response in temperature increase. And this gray bar shows the CO2 that we have released to date. And if you go up, you could see this star. And so that shows that we're at 1.1 degrees of warming. And then the blue bars and the red bars are the remaining budget we have left to hit 1.5 degrees. So you can see these blue bars goes up to the second star. And right now on average, we all emit a little more than 40 billion tons of CO2. And this remaining carbon budget is around 400 billion tons of CO2. So that really only gives us 9 to 10 years left to make critical change. So we really are this code red for humanity, as experts are putting it. And this 9 to 10 years is if no reductions are made. So I do want to have solutions in this presentation. There are still many, many ways that we could stop greenhouse gas emissions and slow down this trend. So just as Marianne was saying, I had the great pleasure to be able to attend United Nations Climate Change Conference. That's called COP, and it's called COP26 because it's its 26th year. I attended as a climate scientist, and there were many successful outcomes. So for the first time, fossil fuels, which are the main driver of climate change, were mentioned in the agreement. So it called for a phase down of unabated coal use and a phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. And this agreement called for greater ambition from countries to stop their emissions, and particularly calling on them to come back next year with updated emission reduction commitments. As a scientist, I was actually really happy to hear this repeated importance of nature-based solutions, which is really great. And two major pledges that came out that countries signed was this global methane pledge, and then also to halt and stop and reverse deforestation by 2030. So these are kind of just some picture snapshots of me there, and Obama was there, Biden was there. There was lots of protests, and it was a very energizing COP, which I think is good. So here are some more specific outcomes from the COP conference. And there was a lot of talk of decarbonization through the increase in green transportation and electric vehicles. There, of course, was talk about a dramatic shift to renewable forms of power and energy storage. Lots of debate on the financing that needs to happen to adaptation around the world. Like I mentioned, the phase down of coal use, the end of deforestation, and then talk about losses and damages to a lot of the southern nations and countries that are being hit with climate change the most. And yeah, a point is that I do want to emphasize that this Glasgow Climate Pact is just an agreement. And at least right now, there's really no real way to enforce it. But unless we all really do support it, so unless we all really do get a lot of citizen support and backing behind this, and the way that we vote and the way that we make our daily choices, we really can help enforce this. So yeah, so one of the major steps of COP26 is the importance to use forests as nature-based climate solutions. And this is a lot of what I work on. And this is great because forests may help us mitigate climate change if they could store carbon for centuries. So that's if they can store this carbon, which these forests have been able to do that for a very long time in the past. And however, this amazing ecological service is becoming threatened with climate change. So forests sequester carbon, but there can be negative issues that you see here in the boxes, like non-permanence, which is that ecosystems are becoming weaker from heat stress or forest loss due to wildfire or pest. Or there can be leakages, such as carbon can be released and moved elsewhere, like in litter fall or into streams. So some of these other issues in these boxes are related to challenges with using forests as carbon offsets. And there's these challenges if we don't have accurate accounting. So recently we found that climate risks to forest offset projections are remarkably high and substantially underestimated in the current versions of these voluntary forest offset protocols. So this really kind of needs to be looked at a lot more. Okay, I'm going to switch now to talking about decarbonization. And just for a quick reference, decarbonization means phasing out fossil fuels in all sectors of our economy. So a decarbonized future is an economy based on energy sources that produce low levels of greenhouse gas emissions. And there are 5 major elements to get to decarbonization. And first, we need to employ energy efficiency to the maximum amount possible. And then second, we need to decarbonize the power or electricity supply. And then once this is done, we then need to push this clean energy into all sectors, which also basically includes switching from fuel combustion to electricity. And then fourth, we need to use zero carbon fuels for the remaining areas that we can't effectively electrify. And then lastly, we do need to have carbon capture and carbon storage and carbon dioxide removal for areas where fossil fuels are still needed. And this is needed to be able to achieve negative emissions. And what's nice about these 5 pillars is that they are multiplicative. So applying them simultaneously can have large societal benefits. So yeah, so for each of these 5 elements of decarbonization, here are the transitions of where we need to get from where we are now in 2020. You can see these bars on the top, and then the targets that we need to hit in 2050. And you can see that switching to more efficient energy in the red, or switching to clean electricity, will significantly reduce our emissions by 2050. And then the share of electricity, of course, needs to become a lot higher. And then kind of lastly, I do want to reiterate is that we are basically not capturing any carbon right now, and this needs to majorly increase. So the lower figure shows the annual CO2 emissions for our current trajectory on the left, if we basically don't do that much, and then where we need to hit to be able to get net zero by 2050. And you see we do need to have this dramatic decrease. And then also to reach this negative amount by 2050, carbon capture has to occur. So this carbon capture, about half of it can actually be utilized for power, which is nice. And then the other half is geologically sequestered. I want to kind of emphasize some positive solutions to take and show some highlights from, this is from a recent Berkeley Lab study that came out last year, and it lays out this more feasible plan for exactly how to get to net zero by 2050 and at much lower cost than expected. So this study it shows 8 different decarbonization options. And out of these options, the figure on the left shows the infrastructure transition for the least cost carbon neutral pathway. And this shows, the infrastructure transition for the power generating capacity. And so you could see this increased need in wind and solar. And then also see the transition in the space and water heating. So in residential buildings, electric heat pumps, of course, need to increase in both for space heating units and for water heating units. And then the electric resistance heater compromise most of the remaining transition that we need to do. And the study showed that this transition can be accomplished over 30 years, and the replacement of the equipment can be at the end of its normal lifetime, and actually even without early retirement. So right now, buildings in the US are about 50% electric, I believe, and to be able to reach net zero, they need to become around 90% or more electrified. So this is a Sanity Key Diagram, and I know it looks a little bit confusing, but we're going to kind of walk through this a little bit. And I just wanted to show this as an example from this Berkeley study that they have found these kind of exact pathways for getting to net zero emissions over time. And a quick way to read this is you look at these from left to right. And when you start on the left, you start with basically that's the energy supply for different pathways. And then the middle shows the conversion process they use for these energies. And all the way at the right, that's the final result of energy consumption. And this top panel is the reference case for what we're doing right now in 2020. And you can see there's still a lot of browns and grays. So a lot of you using fossil fuels that we need to phase out. And the central case is the case that's we need to switch to using more renewables. And so where 80% of the energy comes from wind and solar. And there is also a stronger need for using biomass as an energy supply. The great news that came out of this study is that the cost to do this is about $1 per person per day. And that actually doesn't even account for the climate benefits that we get or not having to pay for climate disasters anymore into the future. So this is significantly a less estimate than years before because of recent technology progress. So, okay, the last section that I'd like to talk about is more about describing climate modeling, which is what I do. And hopefully this can just kind of be a big primer for the rest of this conference to kind of always keep this in mind. And this picture of the globe is an output from the global Earth system model that I personally work on called E3SM. And I'd like to emphasize that today we do have better resolution, better and more ensembles of these models and very accurate predictions. So climate modelings give us outputs of just examples of these figures that I'm showing that can inform us that with every increment of global warming, every increment of CO2, the global mean temperature is getting warmer, and for all continents and for all oceans. And other examples that these models can give us is showing things like the Arctic sea ice has been the lowest it's ever been since 1850. And all regions of the world will experience at least 5 dramatic climate impact drivers. And then as you see in this bottom figure, climate models can also show us the level of impact and risk to different type of natural and human systems that we care about. So the purple bars, you could see that there are very high risks to things like warm water corals or coastal flooding, but there might be a more moderate risk to things like mangroves or tourism. And a lot of these figures are from the IPCC report if people want to look it up at all. So as I mentioned before, nature can absorb CO2 pollution for us. So this is a large free mitigation tool, and especially tropical forests can absorb a lot of CO2 as they grow fast and grow year round. And the right figure shows how much carbon is sequestered into biomass across the globe, as shown in these purple bars. But as you can see from the darker purple bars, this biomass is becoming less in the 2000s. So one of the concerns that I'm working on is trying to understand what are these future limitations to carbon sequestration in the natural world. And hopefully with the COP26 pledges, we could stop a lot of these brown bars that we're seeing, a lot of the release of carbon from things like deforestation and land use change. So every year, I'll be updating the models with trying to see what's happening with basically these carbon sinks and sources, and hopefully more will go into the forest and less coming out. But even with that, yeah, this figure from the IPCC report shows that both the land and ocean, these natural carbon sinks will proportionally become less over time with increasing climate change scenarios. So this going from left to right, depending on what we do with climate mitigation. So yeah, the carbon storage can go from 70% down to a 38% storage potential. And also multiple studies are showing that right now the Amazon forest will stop being a carbon sink by 2035. And this is due to increased forest mortality, fires, and deforestation. But hopefully we can stop deforestation. This can be extended a little bit longer. So yeah, when just looking at the land component of the models, I personally think that there are three large solutions to really help Earth system models more accurately represent biomass storage and natural vegetation, which is key for our future production, our future predictions, excuse me. So our world is shifting to these new novel climates that we haven't seen before, that there's no equivalent to in modern history. So in these models, we need to steer away from just looking at static vegetation. So that's something that I'm working on. And I think these three solutions, are not new by any means, and they have been studied for a while, which is great, but coupling complex nutrient competition or dynamic plant mortality or plant hydrodynamics to atmospheric global physics and ocean and ice circulation in novel climates, that is a grand challenge that me and other scientists are working on, and it is a novel challenge that we need to keep doing. So yeah, so this just quickly is kind of one of the main concepts of one of these solutions that I'm working on to try to help improve vegetation modeling. And initially in climate models, the land was all treated actually as this uniform green blob. So just really as a static green leaf. And this newer class of models that I'm helping to bring in now has many cohorts of different plant functional types that exist on many type of land patches. And this differentiation in size structure and age structure of vegetation is really important to try to understand how these forests are changing over time with disturbance. So we now have much finer heterogeneity in water, energy, and carbon fluxes. And now we could really understand globally how forests are able to dynamically recover from disturbances and stressors and have this mechanistic plant mortality. So this just really opens up the door for much more rigorous scientific testing. Yeah, I'm going to kind of go through this. This is kind of the bottom figure of this. This is a model that I use called FATES, where we really are able to see basically how forests are changing over time. But yeah, another major solution that can really help, and that was talked about at COP26, is this solution of afforestation and using more wood products, using bioenergy, and using green infrastructure. So many mass timber construction materials can be used in building technologies, and they can help replace steel and concrete. And I know this might sound simple, but really having things like urban vegetation, green roofs really can help lower greenhouse gas emissions and cooling urban hotspots. So hopefully this will keep being talked about at every future COP. So yeah, so in closing, as a summary, I just kind of want to stress that there are new modeling techniques to now represent biomass storage that is based on this diverse plasticity of plant traits, and plants changing over time is an emergent feature in these models that can now compete for nutrients, water, and sunlight. But probably more importantly, kind of a step that we're looking into is that this future vegetation can shift into more suitable environments or die in harsher environments. And so that this is something that's new in these models that has never been done in the past. The vegetation was always very constrained to historical climate ranges. And a next solution for more accurate biomass sink is to include multiple interacting agents of plant mortality to respond to changing climates. So how plant mortality responds to temperature, CO2, fire, shading, and then more importantly, trying to understand how these things change over time. And some of the goals that I heard about for the next COP meeting is that in this year at COP26, there was this serious note that there was a serious concern that the current pledges we're still not doing enough, and we're still leading to increasing emissions by 2030. So everybody did decide that we really do need to come back, even in just 1 year, to come back and report at COP27 next year to really start working on a program to really do a faster cut of these emissions by 2030. And I think that's all. Yeah, thank you guys so much for listening. I really appreciate this opportunity. And I guess, yeah, at the end, we'll be taking questions. So thank you so much. And here's my email if you'd like to contact me.
Jennifer, that was excellent. I really want to thank you for giving that great overview of what happened in Scotland, as well as your work and the future. I'm gonna read a couple of the questions to you just so you can start thinking about the answers. We won't go into those now, but there was a question about if you could explain geologically sequestered carbon. And there was a question about, is biomass really a clean energy source? And then there was a question about, does your research also encompass studies of seagrass and the contribution of CO2 storage from seagrass compared to forests? So everybody has to hang on for those answers. I think some of them, you could type some of it into the chat maybe if you want, but we could also, there's also one, can you suggest any resources related to incorporating bio-based carbon reduction into buildings? So those are great questions. We'll try to get to them. Wonderful overview. Thank you so much. So we're going to transition now to Commissioner Andrew McAllister, who's going to be giving you an overview of the decarbonization and energy efficiency policies for the state of California and focusing in on the building sector.
Great. Well, thank you, Marianne. That was great, Jennifer. As you were talking, I went and got a couple other slides to stick into my presentation, hopefully in the right order, so we can to make a few additional connections. But I am going to drill in, as Marianne said, on the buildings as a solution to climate. And Jennifer, you suggested a few of the key issues around buildings. I'm going to drill in on those a little bit and talk about what we're doing in California specifically. First, I want to just thank Marianne and the whole crew for putting this together, a really valuable resource. All of you attending you are key parts of the solution to climate change in a very pragmatic, practical, on the ground way, and it just doesn't happen without you. And so I think there are lots of upsides to this transition that we are on the front end of. It's happening now, but it really needs to scale tremendously rapidly. But to touch, essentially all of our buildings in the state, we have 15 million existing buildings or so, and almost every one of those buildings could use some kind of a decarbonization initiative, some more than others. And I'll talk about that. But the upsides are that our economy will thrive. We will have plenty of jobs out there in the world doing, equipment retrofits and building upgrades. And all of the kind of supply chain links that come with that. And that's technology development, manufacturing, just all of the sort of commensurate, related industries that come along with providing these services to actual people in buildings. There's a lot of education to be done, not only on the sort of technical side. We're firmly in the digital economy, and so there's a lot of sophistication actually in this sector that maybe 20, 30 years ago wasn't there. But also people have to make decisions to adopt these new technologies. And so there's kind of a social transition that comes along with this to actually get people to buy the stuff that you're offering. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this works. Okay, am I full screen there, Marianne?
Yep, you got it.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about decarbonization in California, specifically focused on buildings, and then this thing we're calling flexibility, which is load flexibility in the electric sector, which I'm very excited about. It's kind of something we're leading on, and it's relevant for our electric system as a whole, as we rely more and more on electricity. So there are a few policy drivers. I would be sort of negligent if I didn't mention sort of the main policy drivers here. We have laws that are actually telling us what to do here. The legislature has directed California's decarbonization transition at a high level, and it's left to the agencies, such as the Energy Commission, the Public Utilities Commission, the Air Resources Board to implement these policies. And I've just highlighted a few of them here. So doubling energy efficiency savings, we actually are probably the most efficient large state economy in the state or in the nation. And but we need to do better. We can do much. There's much more potential for energy efficiency. We have a goal to hit 60% renewable electricity by 2030, 100% carbon-free by 2045. That we are, I would say, likely to do it more quickly than that, because we're already touching 60% carbon-free. That kind of depends on how you define renewable. But we're well on our way to the 100% carbon-free goal by 2045, doing lots of modeling on that. And you know, that last 10% or so might be a little challenging, but to get to 90%, we have the technology today. Decarbonizing buildings and industrial processes. I'll talk about the buildings, certainly. We are kind of ramping up our efforts on industry, and hopefully we'll get a little bit of funding from the state budget this year to ramp that up. Transportation is a huge sector that I won't talk about much, but electrification of the transportation sector and decarbonizing the remaining non-electric fuels is a huge task that we're also well on the way of doing. You know, EVs are ramping up quickly in terms of consumer acceptance and the market offerings, but we obviously have a long way to go. There's an executive order that Governor Newsom promulgated that is aiming at light duty completely carbon-free by 2035. So that's a big place where California is also leading. Equity is kind of the primary, I would say, organizing principle for much of what we're doing at the state. And I'll talk a little bit about that. It's super important. We just can't, you know, we have an incredible diversity in the state, economically, culturally, you know, demographically, and we just have to embrace everyone, or else we're not going to, pragmatically, we're just not going to reach our goals. And our Governor Brown actually promulgated an executive order aiming at a carbon-free economy in its entirety by 2045. So we're setting, you know, very aggressive goals. I think in the context of Jennifer's presentation, though, you know, it's on the one hand, we're proposing to do things that have never been done by a large economy, but on the other hand, you could argue that it's actually not even enough given our current goals, because we have to move so quickly. So a clean electric grid is really the cornerstone of decarbonization. And I've just sort of highlighted some of the major elements here. You know, as we electrify transportation, buildings, do more energy efficiency, actually energy efficiency on gas and electricity, but particularly we have to focus on clean and efficient electric use. And R&D, we do a lot of R&D at the Energy Commission. We've got about $1 billion of R&D funding over the next decade that we use, I think, to great effect. It's really a nation-leading state level effort on R&D that we have on clean energy. So as I said, equity really is the foundation. It's just, you know, we have about 40%, 40% of our population in California, of our residents, are low or low moderate income and really don't have a lot of disposable income to invest in their existing buildings. They likely don't even own their home in many cases, and you know, they're under-resourced communities that are really scattered across the state, and they are consuming the same energy everyone else is, and so we need to provide better options to for investment in those communities, and we need to sort of direct those in a way that really responds to those communities' needs. There's a lot of effort going on in across all of our programs at the agency level, not only in the commission, but in the other agencies as well, to really focus on how we best engage and support those communities in their transition. So I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that. We did a report a few years ago now, about looking at barriers to low-income community participation in response to SB 350. So that was a significant document that we sort of strategized how we need to approach it, and we've been executing that document ever since, and sort of as an overlay to all our programs. So broadly, I'll just listed out a few strategies for building decarbonization, and I'll highlight some of these more than others. But we have to electrify our building end uses, and I'll highlight heat pumps as a key strategy here because they are really key to making this work. As I said, decarbonizing our electric generation system, we're getting pretty far down the road on that. Distributed energy resources are a key part of the solution. We really need clean energy generation at all scales, and we need a lot of complementary technologies such as batteries and other energy storage devices kind of scattered throughout the distribution system, and small scale generation as well. I'll talk a little bit about solar in the context of buildings. Refrigerants are a key piece of the puzzle here. HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, are highly greenhouse gas intensive. They have a huge greenhouse global warming potential, and there are some alternatives that are much lower global warming potential that we need to transition to over time. And so we're not primarily the agency, that's the Air Resources Board that focuses on refrigerants, but it is a key piece of the problem, especially as we ramp up the use of heat pumps, which depend on refrigerants to function. I'll highlight that a little bit more. Leakage reduction as well is important. We have to stop venting refrigerants, and so we need better systems to account for the refrigerants that are floating around in the economy. Energy efficiency, also including heat pumps. We don't just want heat pumps, we want efficient heat pumps. Demand flexibility, I'll talk quite a bit about a little bit later. And then decarbonizing the gas system. To the extent there is a gas system, so we electrify a lot of our end uses, there are going to be a number of difficult to electrify end uses. And so we have to make sure that our gas system that remains is as much as possible renewable gas. A lot of discussion about hydrogen these days and other options for decarbonizing the gas system. So heat pumps, these are a key technology. They're inherently efficient. So, heat pumps, even normal, just regular old, standard efficiency heat pumps have, multiples of sort of 300% efficient. So they actually are inherently more efficient than a gas combustion device, but they're getting better all the time. And we need to focus on the most efficient ones that are 400+% efficient. So we are focusing on heat pumps in all of our efforts for building decarbonization, because they are in water heating and space heating. They're really key technology. They have a relatively low penetration in the marketplace today in California. It's higher in some other states that have less pervasive gas distribution, but they are ready for prime time, and we're emphasizing those in the building code and in our programs. And I'll talk about the 2022 building code update, where we are emphasizing heat pump technologies as a baseline technology. So the new building code, the 2022 building code was approved late last year by the California Building Standards Commission. We had adopted it at the Energy Commission. We're an adopting agency. We had done that in August, and it goes into effect January 1st of 2023. So during the course of this year, 2022, we'll be sort of detailing exactly what that means for folks like you who are doing installs in new and change outs in existing buildings. So the code will strongly encourage the use of energy efficient heat pumps. So in terms of code compliance to meet that energy budget in the building code, your easiest pathway will be to focus on energy efficient heat pumps. So that's for space heating and or water heating. And if you do that, you're going to be much more sort of able to build a building that has everything that everything the building purchaser wants, and stay within the energy budget. Now we are not banning gas end uses, but since they are inherently less efficient than heat pumps, there'll have to be additional efficiency measures in a new building in order to meet that energy budget. So if heat pumps really are going to become a standard technology. We're expanding the solar PV requirement, and we're adding some battery storage requirements in certain non-residential building types. So that's I think a key innovation that California has made the last couple building codes cycles. Electric ready. So that's an important piece of the 2022 code, where even if a builder insists or really wants to install a gas end use, say a furnace, they still have to have 220 volts at that site, at that furnace location. Same for the cooktop, for example. Even if you put a gas cooktop in, you got to have that 220 volt circuit right there, so that when the customer wants to change that out, they have the option of doing an induction cooktop. Same for water heating. So the electric ready requirement is sort of future-proofing our buildings and enabling that electric transition. And then we responded to some newish research about indoor air quality, and particularly over gas cooktops, where we needed stronger ventilation requirements to get rid of some of those particulates and other criteria pollutants that accumulate indoors above a cooktop. So we required stronger ventilation above those cooktops, when they are gas. All right, so I'll talk a little bit about new buildings, deep in that conversation. So you can see that with each building code update, this is the CO2, the annual emissions and CO2 equivalents from the building code update. And so, the 2022 code does save CO2. I would say that's it's really more aggressive than is shown there, because that's really with today's mix of electricity and its carbon content, which is relatively low, all things considered, but will continue to decrease. And so the key innovation here, as I said, was the focus on electric end uses. Constant progress that will continue throughout the subsequent building code updates. So electric ready, talked about this a bit already. So electrical circuits for space heating, water heating, cooking, and clothes dryers as well. If you have a gas clothes dryer, you have to put the 220 volt circuit there. Also, the electrical panel and the branch circuits have to be sized accordingly for, to meet those future electric loads. And then there has to be a transfer switch that enables a future installation of battery storage. We have not required batteries in homes, but again, the circuitry will be there. And that's when you build a new home, that's relatively inexpensive to put in versus a retrofit situation, which is much more expensive down the road. So I'm going to dwell on this a little bit. I'm moving into existing buildings. And so I want to we did this big report in response to Assembly Bill 3232, which required us to do an assessment of what it would take to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from buildings by 40% from 1990 levels by 2030. And so each bar represents a strategy, sort of a standalone strategy. And so energy efficiency is there for both gas and electric. Electrification strategies of various levels of aggressiveness are there. And you can see that the tallest bars are aggressive electrification and efficient aggressive electrification. And so the efficient aggressive is really just making sure that we're using the best available technology as end uses are converted to heat pumps, as heating end uses are converted to heat pumps. And so that dotted line, that upper dotted line, is 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. If you count, basically, if you take a site approach. So there are two kinds of emissions associated with buildings. One is from electric end uses, you have overall buildings are about 25% of emissions. And about half of that 25% is from the electric sector, from the electric system, from the smokestacks and the power plants that are using fossil fuels to provide the electricity to that building. The other half is the on-site emissions from the gas combustion at that building, say in the furnace or in the water heater, in the gas water heater. So to get to 40% below 1990 levels, you really have to deal with both. Now we're going great guns on decarbonizing the electric sector. The more difficult piece is the gas combustion on site. And so that's why efficient electrification strategies are really the most impactful decarbonization tool that we have, because they transfer away from combustion on site to an efficient electric system. And so that just makes it very clear that in order to get the buildings to sort of do their share of our overall decarbonization enterprise, we've got to electrify as many end uses as possible. And then the little hatch on top of each column is the refrigerant impact. And I mentioned that earlier. Refrigerants have a very high global warming potential. And so there's a SB 1383 is a bill that asks the Air Resources Board to move towards decarbonized refrigerants. And so that crosshatch is the impact of that bill that the Air Resources Board will be implementing in the coming decade. So the way we get above 40% in terms of our savings is by doing aggressive electrification. There's really, we can combine some of these strategies and we can do more electric and gas efficiency, which we should do. It's very cost effective. But really the big kahuna here is electrifying. And so here's another way to look at those strategies, same strategies here. And these are all dollars. All these numbers are dollars. The blue dollars are in thousands. So that's basically $40 billion for the efficient aggressive electrification strategy. That comes to about $142 per metric ton of CO2. And so you can see from these numbers, and actually the real numbers to get across all of our buildings are actually quite a bit higher than this, probably in the 100+ billion range to do our whole state and get to all the buildings. And you can see it's really a generational investment. Our infrastructure investment in the state. You don't make investments this large in the energy sector routinely. There really is a shift that needs to be very intentional, very managed by policymakers, by implementers like the Energy Commission and the Public Utilities Commission in concert with the utilities and all of the sort of supply chain for building technologies, of which you are an essential part. So the coming decade or two is going to see a shift in investment patterns into our buildings. And so that's why, at the beginning, I said there are going to be a lot of jobs associated with this. Well, this is why, because we're going to really do this monumental generational shift in how we approach building decarbonization. So our existing buildings are incredibly important. I've suggested that, these aggressive electrification strategies. So I wanted to just highlight some of the challenges here to get into the levels of investment in decarbonization that we really need to make it happen. We need to link up, the state can start the ball with programs and incentives and some subsidies, particularly targeted at disadvantaged communities, and frontline communities. That has to take place, but really we need private capital to come in and partner and do the bulk of the heavy lifting in terms of funding these retrofits. And so that's an ongoing effort that we're making. There's a lot of capital out there looking for a place to go, but it needs to be kind of in a predictable way with a return that's relatively understood. We don't have a lot of cycles of burnout of appliances. Really the next burnout of any given appliance, we need to focus on electrifying it. And so that means we got to get to it. There's a lot of, as I said before, education, consumer familiarity. We've got to really work with communities to get them comfortable with these approaches, and sort of grease those supply chains and scale up. Rates, energy is not inexpensive. And so electricity and natural gas both are predicted to rise in terms of their cost, per unit. And so as we electrify more, that'll mitigate that. You'll have the same fixed cost spread across more kilowatt hours. So that should mitigate price or rate increases on the electric side. But in any case, we have to be very intentional about that. And the existing electric and gas system infrastructure, we have to focus on that. There has to be good infrastructure on the electric side, as demand scales, and also as we sort of peel back some of the gas end uses, we have to make sure that the gas system remains safe, and that safety is kind of job one there as well. So I'm going to now move in to talk about flexibility. It's the last thing I'll talk about. But this is I need to get the updated one. It's shifted a little bit between 2019 and 2022. But this is a sort of an hourly, by month, an average hourly carbon content of our electric grid. You can see sort of in the spring and summer, spring in particular, we have a lot of renewables, a preponderance of renewables, which decreases the carbon content. That's that green sector there. The middle of the day in May and June, we have a highly we have a low carbon electricity system. But when there's not sun and there's not much wind and there's high demand, say, in the middle of the day and in the heat of summer in August, and certainly, in the wee hours of the morning when you don't have a lot of solar and you may not have a lot of wind, but you still have some demand, that's when the carbon content goes up. So we really need to work on having loads that can take that green energy and not take that red energy, and really sort of, take the peanut butter knife and spread that green energy around to other hours, to increasing number of hours throughout the year. And so that's the sort of motivation around load flexibility as a solution to decarbonization, as well as reliability and cost containment, right? So flexibility really can help us with all three of those key goals for the electric system of the future. So we have a bunch of efforts going on at the Energy Commission. We're developing load management standards. That's going to sort of enable a prices to devices. So when you have a time of use rate, it's going to sort of enable the automation of devices that do have flexibility to consume that green energy and not consume that red energy. So that'll enable flexibility to kind of be built into the way that the system runs just optimally, day in and day out. We also have a new authority that the legislator gave us to require native flexibility to appliances. And so that means that, say, your water heater will be able to receive a signal that does what I just said based on a load management standard signal. Say, hey, you preheat your water because energy is going to be more expensive, or don't use the heating element in your water heater. Don't turn it on, your heat pump water heater, until the price goes below X, or until there's no longer a flex alert. Don't turn it on if there's a congestion signal from the independent system operator, say. So that's load flexibility, sort of really having the system, having loads kind of ebb and flow according to the conditions out there on the grid. And that's going to be a key piece of the puzzle here. So the end use devices that have those controls are going to require people who know all about them to install them and make sure they're installed and commissioned properly. So that's where we're going. This is the electric system of the future. As I said, the building code focuses also rewards flexibility as well. So there's some of that. We do a lot of R&D on load flexibility. The Cal Flex Hub is I think a $16 million 4-year investment that we've made, and Berkeley Lab is actually the lead contractor on the Cal Flex Hub. So we're going to be learning a lot of developing technologies enabling flexibility. SB 100 is our modeling effort for the overall grid decarbonization, and it is showing that load flexibility helps manage cost and improves reliability out there in the grid. And then the California Public Utilities Commission is doing a lot of complementary things to what we're doing at the Energy Commission, and we're working together very closely. And they have a distributed energy resources action plan that they've just updated to version 2.0. We're collaborating a lot with them on that. So load management standards, I'll speed up here to leave some time for questions, but it is enabling kind of a prices to devices. So keeping time-dependent rates out there in the cloud, having hourly components, a time-based component for rates will be out there, and it'll be API compatible. So third parties can automatically read it, it's machine readable. And so devices out there that have native load flexibility will be able to respond automatically. And so, so these elements are part of the load management standards, and we're going to be requiring the utilities to maintain that rates database in real time, so that it becomes usable by a much broader range of providers. And so you can see it can take various signals. The rate database is called MIDAS, Market Informed Demand Automation Server. It's in the cloud. And it can take a carbon signal, it can take a rates signal, it can take a flex alert signal, and it can automate the response at the end use level, at the device level, to those signals. So congestion, price, carbon content. So it's really gonna I think, revolutionize, I'll use that word a little bit liberally, but it's gonna really enable new ways of enhancing reliability and managing cost for consumers. So the second thing I'll highlight along the for load flexibility is our flexible demand appliance standards. I mentioned that earlier. This is a series of rulemakings, by end use device to incorporate, where it's cost effective and feasible, native load flexibility. So I think the number two here are kind of the big ones, water heaters and battery storage. They're relatively complex, but we'll be getting to those actual formal rulemakings late this year, probably, to develop regulations that really spell out what's going to be required for water heaters and battery storage, along with thermostats and pool pumps and other loads that lend themselves to flexibility. So this is my final slide, and I just wanted to sort of give the CPUC, the California Public Utilities Commission, its due for developing the DER action plan. And you can see on track one, it's all about load flexibility and rates. And so we really are working hand in glove with them to support the sort of transmission of the right signals for grid reliability and carbon reduction through rates that consumers actually see, that enable them to save money by doing the right thing. So anyway, I'm very excited about this, as you can tell, and happy to answer any further questions about what we're doing on buildings. And with that, I will wrap up. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thanks so much, Andrew. It's really exciting to see the broad portfolio here in California. And it's really remarkable because the rest of the country's watching. And we really appreciate your leadership in helping to kind of create the future vision. And we got a whole bunch of questions. So what I think I'll do is I'll give you a question, and then I'll kind of go back and forth one to one. Jennifer's answered a couple of them in chat. But the first question we got, there was actually a question that I think I'll hold off because it was to Jennifer, but I think Andrew might have a comment on it. But let me first give a comment to a question for Andrew. I got a question about the role of unions in decarbonization and jobs. And the state's High Road Training Partnership is working on this, but it's not covered much in this conference. And I think if you could comment a little about jobs and unions and the role of decarbonization.
Well, so thanks for that question. We know that the labor movement ensures quality in training, and so I think there's sort of labor with a big L and labor with a small L, and I don't really want to kind of get into the scrum there, but I do want to just acknowledge that the labor movement and sort of the unionized labor really does invest in the kinds of training that we need to ensure quality installations of these technologies. I highlighted the relative sophistication of some of these technologies. They have to be communicating, they have to be well commissioned. They're not just throw in the device and walk away. They do have to be part of a system, and they have to be installed and understood and commissioned as part of that system. If we're going to have our heat pumps contribute to grid reliability, that has to doing that properly at the installation really comes from training at a high level. And so I think our training centers across the state, there's several of them across the state that various unions across the state manage and maintain. They really do the kinds of training that we need to succeed across the state. If somebody is being sold a device that with the the pitch that, hey, this is going to help you save money and it's going to contribute to our solution, our decarbonization solution, and it's going to provide you really reliable service, well, we have to deliver on that. And so our workforce has to be very well trained. And so I would say we do have the infrastructure to do that training, and we have to leverage that to the greatest extent possible. And investing in that in the near term saves a lot of money in the long term. And so we've really learned that over the years. So I want to just call out the labor training centers across the state as being great platforms for that evolution.
Yeah, thank you. It's you both outlined what we need to do, and all the questions are about how are we going to do it. How are we really going to do this? So Jennifer, you answered a question around geologic carbon storage, but then there was actually a follow-up question where Robert Nuremberg asks, option 2 is listed. Is there any address to concerns of creating hazards related to hydrogen sulfide gas?
Yeah. Thank you for this question of asking a little bit more about geologically sequestering carbon and this carbon removal. And yeah, just in case other people didn't see the chat, some of my quick answers is that we can have this geological storage and things like saline aquifers and storage into the depleted oil and gas reserves. And I think that's where the follow-up question came. And then also kind of lastly, this is where a lot of research is going, is that we could sequester this into these alkaline rich rock formations. So just through the natural weathering process, which is really nice. And there's a lot of research that's being done at Berkeley Lab that can speed up this natural weathering process. So through an enhanced weathering. And then I have to say, to really apologize to the person who asked the follow-up question, is that I just do not know enough about this and related to hydrogen sulfide gas. And I was kind of trying to quickly look up a little bit of answers to that, but I don't do too much of the geological side at all with carbon sequestration. And so I actually don't know that much about the hazards related with the sulfide gas. And I apologize for that.
That's fair. It's, we like understanding all the range of technology here is a big challenge. There's so many facets of it. Not only are there facets of the technology, but there's the economics. And Andrew, I'm going to combine two questions that I received about costs. One person said, I thought it was cost prohibitive to retrofit homes, put in a heat pump. We all know that's really expensive. So if you could talk a little about what we know about the costs for decarbonizing homes. And there was a related question around, I guess the PUC proposed $600 million equity fund for low income DERs. And that's, of course, for low income, there might be incentives, but for a lot of families, they're still going to be looking at, first of all, people don't know what heat pumps are.
Yeah.
And then they're like, wow, well, that's expensive. Why would I do that? So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, we have to really define and nurture and fund the supply chain for the technologies that we want. And we've done that with gas over the last few decades, right? So, when you get a new gas hookup to a new construction, that's partially subsidized in rates. And so there's incentives to kind of go down, the road that we kind of set as at the policy level. Now, rate making and there's a mention of the PUC. Rate making is done for the investor-owned utilities at the PUC. So I don't do that at the Energy Commission. And so, but rates are a key tool to provide the incentives that are going to move the market toward the technologies that we want. And at the large publicly owned utilities, they do their own rate making. LADWP and SMUD, they have boards that make those decisions for them. So getting to our existing buildings, I would encourage folks to look at the Assembly Bill 3232 report, because it does lay out some costs of what this is going to take, to get to our existing buildings to electrify these critical end uses. At the new construction, it's really a matter of scale, in my view. There are offsetting costs, like running gas pipe actually does cost more than running Romex. And so at the new construction, there are builders can make choices that actually do kind of make that very accessible at no or very low incremental cost. The retrofits of existing buildings, as the questioner says, is more challenging. It absolutely is. And so we need to really find approaches and business models that enable that to happen. And we're looking at some innovative programs across the state, across the nation, and across the world. I mean, there are all jurisdictions who are serious about decarbonization are asking these same questions and have identified this same pathway. We're working with the original equipment manufacturers, HVAC and water heating, to really optimize the offerings that they have to make retrofits lower cost and more accessible to more people. But programmatically, we've really got to make sure that we're focusing on community-wide solutions and really supporting the supply chain and the end user in making these investments. We have to walk in this through the front door. There's really there's no easy solution, right?
Yeah, thank you. So I think Peter and Larry know we have questions both in the Q&A part of the Zoom platform as well as the chat. So I'm going to try to cover both. I'm looking at them and trying to pick among them. Question for Jennifer: is biomass really a clean energy source?
Yeah, I really like this question, and I wanted to answer it more verbally instead of typing in a response because it is extremely complicated, the answer. It is true that parts of biomass are not completely a clean energy source, that there are parts of in the biomass kind of conversion process that can be dirty. But I think the best way for me to answer this is that we're in this period right now of all hands on deck, that we need to do everything we can to stop fossil fuel emissions. So it's almost at choosing a lesser maybe of two evils. We need to stop oil and coal and emissions from fossil fuels. And if biomass is a better resource, then we're at a point right now where we need to take that. So it's not completely green. Maybe I think to answer that question, wind and solar is really great renewable resources, but there's areas of the world where you can't always use wind and solar, and many developing countries where biomass is an only option. And so right now it is a better option. But yeah, there's a lot of kind of controversies with it. And in biomass, there's also things like biofuels, and biocrops that kind of all fall under this, and different, maybe you guys all know the kind of different ways of doing oil palm plantations or biofuels can be very destructive to the environment and very dirty. So there's nuances in answering this question. It's a little hard. There's clean ways of dealing with biofuels, biocrops, and then there's very dirty ways and very environmentally destructive ways as well. But yeah, I think to answer the question, we just need to do everything we can right now to stop fossil fuels.
Yeah.
And a little bit in that Sankey diagram, I think I showed that when you start with biomass as an energy source, it's actually changing it to where we're not just starting with biomass as an energy source to the end product. There is kind of that transfer period where you can use it into hydrogen and liquid and gas that is a little bit more greener and sustainable. I'm trying to think of other kind of issues with this topic, but yeah. It's a complicated one.
Right, and I think there's a whole spectrum of technology in the bioenergy, topic. So appreciate that. Thank you. Mm-hmm. So Andrew, I'm going to go back to the Q&A, and there was a question about existing buildings and the potential for envelope improvements. Mm-hmm. And the person wrote that, how do you think about envelope improvements relative to electrification? And is that just energy efficiency? Or if we think about how the public responds and they have better comfort, they might be more willing to accept this kind of technology if they're lower bills and more comfortable. So you can talk about how envelope improvements fit in.
Yeah, I could not agree with this question more. It sort of is a little bit of a leading question, which I'm glad it leads in that direction because I completely agree. And just, by the way, I think California has really been emphasizing shell for decades. Like the building shell is the building block for a high-performing, efficient home. I'm actually talking to you from my own home here, which is a passive house, which has really thick walls and lots of insulation. It's all electric, heat pumps all around, and it has very low running costs, and it's extremely comfortable. And that starts with the shell, and that's windows, walls, the air sealing, the whole bit. And those are relatively inexpensive things to do, particularly if you're talking about ceiling insulation and envelope sealing, SEAL. Those are relatively straightforward things to do that have a massive comfort benefit and decrease the running costs of the building. And so that's independent of whether you electrify that building. Now, we also have to electrify as many end uses as we can because, as Jennifer said and others in the chat, we do have to decrease combustion, both for the CO2 emissions and also for the criteria pollutants that were sort of part of that last question. So I think if we're going to go out and retrofit the buildings for decarbonization, then we really have to start with that basic energy efficiency, such as building shell. And that has other benefits. It lets you downsize your HVAC system. It lets you, optimize in other ways. And so that really is part of an integrated package of retrofits that really has to be the primary offering to our existing buildings across the state, and what programs are and will be supporting.
Thanks, Andrew. And behind me is this picture of Flex Lab, which is our test bed where we actually can change out the windows, the HVAC systems. We can change out the plug loads, and we also at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab do a lot of work on windows and facades to try to create better shells that can actually collect energy at some time and shade the cooling and insulate. A question for both of you: where does nuclear fit in? Jennifer, any thoughts?
Yes, okay. Nuclear, I think does fit in and is needed, but I think we could do so much more first with solar and wind, and with how cheaper solar and wind has gotten, how much more efficient it is. And yeah, it is something on the playing field of trying to tackle all of climate change. I think people probably realize that some of the still kind of dangerous aspects with nuclear is dealing with the waste, dealing with a lot of the dangerous aspects of nuclear. But we need research to be able to really understand how can we deal with nuclear safely, deal with the waste safely. And I think that is kind of in the tool belt. So it's not off the table, but I think a lot more research needs to go into it. And in the meantime, research is there on solar and wind, which is nice, and it's more efficient. So I don't know, that's a very generic.
No, that's great. That's great. I totally agree.
I would just add that, in California, it actually is off the table until the legislature changes its mind and makes new nuclear actually legal, because currently it's illegal to build a new nuclear power plant in California. And in fact, the last functioning nuclear power plant in California, Diablo Canyon, is slated to go offline in a few years. And so, but I do, I'm relatively agnostic about nuclear, just because, it is, it does have a lot of downsides, as you mentioned. It does have some major downsides, and, until we can deal with the waste, it's really hard to contemplate generating, that much more of it. Because right now, all the nuclear plants across the country are basically storing their spent nuclear fuel on site. And that's a problem. And we need the Department of Energy to move forward with their statutory obligation to find a high-level nuclear waste repository. Yeah. And they're decades behind on that obligation, and everyone else is just kind of in stasis until that happens. And so I think that it's hard to contemplate doing a lot of new nuclear until we have that problem fixed. And that's a big lift.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So really quickly, I'm going to ask one more question that you can both make a comment on, and then I'll let you make any closing remarks. We only have a minute left. There was a comment about, are there good business cases of carbon project development for buildings? How carbon markets can help successful building decarbonization projects? That's a tough one.
I'll actually just take a quick stab at that. So California is a little bit different from many other states in that we have a cap and trade program. And so we actually have a market for carbon allowances that functions. It's kind of, it's ebbed and flowed in terms of its profit. It's the carbon price and the auction success. But there has been a consistent fund from the cap and trade auctions that has been able to provide resources for decarbonization programs. And so that's a mechanism that is functioning and has brought a lot of decarbonization benefit to California. I think there are other where cap and trade does not exist, and where you don't have any sort of market mechanism that's aligning incentives with decarbonization. We ought to be, this could be other states or at the federal level, putting together ways to monetize carbon reductions in order to provide capital in the near term to actual decarbonization projects. And so I think there's some models there that could be done at much greater scale. Basically saying, okay, what's the net present value of the future stream of carbon reductions, and take that money, bring investors in and invest in projects based on that future income stream. So those kinds of financial mechanisms really need to be much more pervasive for carbon.
That's great. So I really appreciate that answer. So let me just give you guys an opportunity for any final closing thoughts or statements you might want to make to this audience. Jennifer, you first.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess, kind of coming off of COP26 and thinking about COPs in the future, and just how it was really galvanizing and interesting there. And we have so much work to do. I actually think I have a major takeaway that I want to give to the audience from a climate science perspective is actually just talk about climate change to your friends and family. I don't think it's actually talked about enough. It sounds scary. It sounds really big. It's looming. We don't know what it is, or we're afraid to bring it up in conversations. But the more we talk about it, the more we start thinking about it. And just even simple things and being like, hey, it's really weird that the snowpack has been different in Tahoe this year, you know, and just like, what's happening with that? Why isn't there as much snow? Or just very simple things related to your life. And I think just the more we talk about climate change, the more when we start thinking about making small little adjustments in our life and things that we buy and choices that we make. So yeah, I don't know.
Thank you so much. Andrew?
Just a couple things. I mean, so I agree with that. And I think, you know, there are a lot of sort of popular misconceptions about climate change. You know, for example, we've gotten a ton of snow so far this year. You know, we've had these massive storms come through. There's tons of snow in Tahoe. That is not proof that climate change does not exist, right? It's really, you know, global weirding as much as global warming, right? And so just the weirdness of the weather, I think, is something that is becoming clearer, and is something that can influence the popular imagination, and making those links to climate change, all the tornadoes, all the hurricanes. You know, it's sort of, everyone knows that the weather is stranger than it was when you know, people of our certain age, right? That that the weather is stranger than when we were kids. And so that we need to make those connections, because that is a function of of just the irregularities that that are starting to appear in climate based on you know, emissions over the decades. And so I think that's one. I just think that popularizing the fact that it's with us and we're dealing with it today in real time, I think can help people sort of like, okay, well, what do I do about it? Well, then what do you do about it? You know, I think the choices that people make in their day-to-day lives, you know, EVs are a real option. They're out there. If you're gonna, you know, get a new car, you know, that's what you ought to do. You know, we need to find better solutions for lower income people, as I said, you know, as we've all said multiple times. You know, we have to really link climate change to actual decisions and help people understand that we actually have a lot of good options that are low carbon options. This is not a suffering thing. This is an evolution. And so you know, the products that you buy that are cleaner and better designed and low carbon are better products. You know, they're stuff that you want. And so I think as people that dawns on people, and it starts to shift our economic focus at some scale, we're going to enable these solutions that we're talking about at a scale that's really going to move the needle on emissions. And so you know, the urgency to do that is really strong. And the last thing I'll say is just again, on the jobs front, you know, a transition like this it opens up all sorts of opportunity for growth in the directions that we want. And so the folks that are listening here today are really on the front end of that evolution, and there's going to be a huge expansion in this sector. So if you dedicate yourself to this particular line of work, you're going to have a career that's very well sustained over the next coming decades.
That's a great point. Great way to end this for this group. Thank you so much, Jennifer Holm, research scientist from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and Commissioner Andrew McAllister from the California Energy Commission. Thank you so much for spending time with us. And we have a happy new year, and we look forward to keeping in touch with you. I don't know whether we can send you all these questions to answer. That would be kind of fun. So there's a bunch more we get into. I'm sorry for those of you that had questions that we didn't get to them. It's been a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne, for everything you do and your colleagues. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Happy New Year.